Right. Right. I'm just going to get this. Perfect. Right. So, hi everyone. So my name is Shelby, and today I'd just like to thank you all for attending the talks that we're presenting today. So I hope that you've all been enjoying the evening so far. And today I'm going to be giving a presentation based on a dissertation piece that I've recently submitted, considering the place of video games in fine art. So a little bit on me and my background. So I am a multidisciplinary artist who creates immersive video games, and I'm a recent graduate of the new BSc Video Games and Virtual Reality course at the Glasgow School of Art. We are the first year graduating this year, so hopefully you'll be seeing a little bit more of us around, and developing my skills at the GSA specifically has allowed me to kind of approach video games from the perspective of an art school, which for me has been really rewarding as a creative. So I predominantly work as a solo dev, but I create kind of a lot of weird art games, and I also have a love for impactful aesthetics and a love for kind of like cinematic narratives. My work focuses a lot on visual development and spatial cinematography, and I have also a little bit of a love for working with sound as well. And over the past year, I have been working on my largest solo project, which is A Journey Through Love and Time, and my dissertation topic that's considering the place of games as art. The topic is a little bit heavy, so I'm just going to try and get through it as fast as possible, just because it's obviously translated from the dissertation, but I've tried to make it a little bit easier and lighter for the sake of the talk. So first, what is art? How do we describe art? So art is described as the creative expression of human thought and emotion, particularly through the use of traditional mediums such as painting or drawing or sculpting. But it might also refer to other historical or contemporary bodies of work, such as music, theatre, or writing. And it doesn't have a singular definition in the context of academic discussion. There's not really a one-size-fits-all solution to what we consider art to be. It's commonly accepted that art is sometimes separated into high art, which we can sometimes refer to as fine art. So that's art that we commonly deem to be like of aesthetical, cultural, historical relevance, or sometimes low art, which is also referred to as popular art, which is art created for mass consumption that may or may not be considered intellectually or emotionally challenging. So Leo Tolstoy, a Russian author and essayist, explored definitions of art in his book, What is Art? He concluded that infectiousness is a cornerstone in evaluating art, and the concept that the author of the work is attempting to transmit a statement or perspective or emotion through a work. This is kind of broken down into three major components: individuality, clearness, and sincerity. The individual quality of a work's expression of its ideas, how distinguishable these ideas are to the audience, and the honesty of the author's intention, which can be shrouded by artificiality, shock value, imitation, things such as that. In this fashion, art isn't really evaluated by medium or execution or aesthetics, or even technical merit, but on conceptuality and authenticity. To create a definition for art is one task, but to investigate the conditions of what makes fine art is another. So Cheyenne Bauman of the University of Toronto argues that what we consider to be fine art is influenced by a range of social conditions, which is summarized by three major factors. So one, the opportunity space, which is aspects that are external to the development of art culture, that are creating the space in the culture that legitimizes the need for evolution. Recontextualization, so the reevaluation and development of the perspective, the function, and the consumption of the work within the field itself. And lastly, critical discourse, so judgments of the work, both positive and negative, that provide value and significance to the legacy of the work. So in this fashion, it can be argued that the legacy of fine art is progressive, and that no art can evolve into fine art without being without going through the kind of contextual trials proposed by Bauman. For this reason, I kind of tend to prefer to visualize art into categories of kind of fine art or general art or just simply art, and that by using this method of visualizing the evolution of art objects, no art is necessarily invalidated, whilst all art in some form is interpreted into our narrative. So, what are video games? So video games are digital activities in which players control a structured form of play using an electronic device. So video games have not existed for that long. Games have obviously existed for centuries, but video games are a relatively new medium, with the commercial debut of video games only being about 50 years old. And in 1983, Video Game Player magazine provided us with one of the earliest known examples of a video game being referred to as art when they discussed video games as art in their 1983 Golden Joystick Awards, as you can see there. So, here we have a quote from Wolfgang Kramer, who's an accredited game designer. And here he describes the two components that create a game. And he conveniently describes them using kind of computer metaphors. Whilst many critics argue that a game, specifically defined by kind of its elements of rules in relation to competition, he describes rules in the context of goals rather than winning or losing. So in this matter, a goal as simple as completing the experience can be considered winning an experience. Considering this, some equate the difference between art and games to be that you can't win in art. But here we could argue that the goal isn't always to win, but just to achieve an outcome. Some video games notably lack any form of losing conditions, for example, The Night Journey. So in the book, The Aesthetics of Play by industry veteran Brian Upton, he theorizes that interpretation itself is a form of interactivity. So in this manner, we could potentially consider art in the wider context to be interactive in a similar manner to games. So whether or not this is kind of the intentional meaning or a dynamic meaning, that's totally irrelevant. It's the audience's role in the perception of the work that is part of the process and is part of the interpretation and critical discourse. So here he continues, and he conceptualizes that two aspects that he deems to be foundational of a game are the rules that provide the structure for the gameplay, that he describes as software, and the physicality of the game that he describes as hardware. So using archaeological discoveries as examples, he explains how these two elements are dependent. So a game cannot be separated correctly, cannot be played correctly if it's separated or lost. Video games are a little bit different, however. Chris DeLeon of the Georgia Institute of Technology actually says that the primary difference between traditional games and digital games is that traditional games will have what we would kind of call rules, whereas digital games would have what we describe as law. So a video game requires material hardware, such as electronics and systems, and software rules, such as objects, art, and code. The separation between traditional game rules and computer game rules is what we could probably describe as automated enforcement of rules, which is kind of just a byproduct of computer limitations. So in traditional games, there are written and unwritten rules. In this instance, you are limited to agreed upon conditions of the rules, whilst the unwritten rules might be based on just fairness and common sense. But in digital games, all rules are written in code. But due to the limitation of engines and codes and computers, what is unwritten also becomes rule. So in this manner, we can hypothesize that in our kind of contemporary definition of what constitutes a video game, games are less about the traditional context of completion and rules and more about the art of interactivity in and of itself. Interactivity is the method of artistic communication. But just as much as people debate the legitimacy of art, arguments have formed within the games community as to whether or not these experiences actually classify as games. In early reviews of Passage, Alec Muir, which he's a co-founder of Rock, Paper, Shotgun, suggests that the game's credentials as an actual game versus an interactive experiment are debatable. However, as time has progressed over the years, a lot of people have become a lot more open-minded to art games, and a lot of the ones that were debated are often now celebrated. So how is the definition of art understood in the context of video games? There are examples of games as contemporary art that predate the commercial debut of video games, carrying their mechanics as the message. Celia Pierce notes a range of contemporary alternative takes of chess in her presentation Plays the Thing, with notable examples including Yoko Ono's Play It by Trust, which is an interactive game art piece which consists of an entirely white chess set, where the design becomes a commentary on the futility of war. In these examples, it is shown that a game's lack of obvious playability may also be a mechanic of play as well. So Roger Ebert, an award-winning film critic, very famously argued that he never considered video games to be worthy of being art, particularly due to their idea that there is no singular physical perspective or narrative that a video game provides, as opposed to a film. Although he did later admit that Soft Edge's Cosmetology of Kyoto is a game that he would consider art. So here's your example. So he believes that due to the narrative of a game not being linear, that it can't be art. However, opinions from perspective like these failed to consider aspects of art, such as large-scale sculpture installations that might be viewed from a range of physical perspectives, or architecture where an individual's reception of the work is based on their physical proximity and progression through an environment. It could be argued that game worlds, particularly walking simulators, may be an extension of these forms of art practice, and that digital avatars present us with a vessel for experiences within these universes. And similarly, if art were linear, then dynamical meaning would not exist. Previously, Kramer discussed that a game should have a goal, which we defined as liberally as completion. It should have the beginning, the course, and an end. And although this isn't particularly comparable to paintings or sculptures, it is comparable to novels, film, and theatre, which he does consider to be art, or have the potential to be art. All art theoretically runs its course within the mind of the viewer. This idea of emotional, social, or political infection that we previously discussed. So through the discourse that fine art takes on, we come to our own conclusions about the narrative of a piece. Phelan Parker of the University of Toronto recognizes the relevance of indie games as a precondition for art games in the context of development within the opportunity space that we discussed. He makes comparison between the aesthetical climate of art games, such as low resolution, graphics, low production value, and compares it to the infancy of artistic movements within other medias, such as the development of punk music or art house films. So in this fashion, the rise of art game culture may be comparable to other disciplines. And this directly contradicts Ebert's statement that video games culturally do not have the same artistic foundings as their contemporary predecessors. Parker also makes the comparison between realism in art games and David Bordwell's findings on realism in art cinema, and how audiovisual representation is secondary to the thematic ambiguity of an art media. Similarly, this kind of aligns with the opinion that interpretation or interactivity is an important aspect of all artistic mediums. He continues stating that the existential and contemplative nature of art games creates a clear genre distinction between art games and commercial video games, noting that the accessibility of indie games contributes to the idea that the media is meant to be replayed, contemplated, and discussed. So interestingly, Hideo Kojima also doesn't believe that video games can be art. In this quote, he specifically makes the comparison between video games and cars due to their interactive nature. So he suggests that although a concept car might be considered art, an average car that is used by several people is a service and therefore not art. So in this fashion, it could be argued that not all video games are art, as they provide us with a means to an end, entertainment. But this theory doesn't actually reject the idea that there cannot be art games, and suggests that for every 100 or so cars, there is at least one we can discuss as art, the concept car. And this idea is applicable to video games also. The idea is not necessarily to argue that all video games should be considered as art, but that they all have the potential to be. The concept that games are simply entertainment, and that because they are entertainment, they can never be art, kind of permeates in this industry. And it can be said that individuals often struggle to unpack their perception of what a video game should and shouldn't be, particularly due to the perception that video games are just a form of entertainment. This kind of creates a prejudice towards video games, and it can be noted that players often struggle to navigate games with notably serious or difficult contexts, potentially due to players equating interactive media with play or playfulness. Subject matter potentially becomes more difficult to digest when the player feels as though they have a hand in the narrative. So AAA games have been mocked by the public for seemingly distasteful interactive segments. In Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, the game received a lot of criticism for a quick-time event in which players are asked to press a button in order to pay respects at a character's funeral. This later became an internet meme due to many arguing that the elements of interactivity in the scene are absurd or insincere. Historically, it can also be noted that video games have been kind of criticized for their hypothetical role in contributing to social violence, with one of the primary recurring arguments relating to the nature of interactivity and player choice. These social opinions may contribute to the prejudices of interactivity as a form of narrative communication, and this perspective of video game prejudice kind of trickles its way down into independent development. And this leads to a lot of art games being scrutinized on the grounds of interactivity, being seen as inappropriate as a method of communication for difficult narratives. So here we have a game called That Dragon Cancer, which was created by Ryan and Amy Green, which tells the story of their son Joel, who passed away 4 years after being diagnosed with cancer at 12 months old. The developers later claimed that it was really difficult to obtain funding towards the end of the project, as it became difficult to get the funding from investors, as they were kind of struggling with the subject matter being in an interactive medium. But games are slowly becoming more accepted as a serious method of artistic communication. One of the defining first moments of acceptance of kind of video games as art was the inclusion of a video game exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum in 2012. And since this, there have been many institutionally recognized instances of video games being considered art, such as with exhibitions at the V&A, or even permanent museums such as the National Video Game Museum in the UK and the Computerspiel Museum in Berlin. Institutions such as the Glasgow School of Art having video games courses, and the Royal College of Art has started including 3D modelling and virtual reality classes within their contemporary art practice curriculums. So things like this are beginning to show us of the acceptance of games in mainstream art culture. There are also collectives for art games. So Kokoromi focus on using video games as a vessel of communication for their works, and formerly studios such as Tale of Tales would focus on creating art games. However, there are not a lot of these groups that are currently creating games, and I definitely believe that there's something to be said about the decline in popularity of the art game, at least in the mainstream. So according to Wikipedia's list of notable games under the art game category, during the 2000s there are over 80 games listed, whereas from 2010 to 2019 there are only 32 listed, so that's over a 60% decrease, and it's predominantly towards the end of the decade. So whilst there's something to be said about the increase in visibility of games in exhibitions, a lot of these exhibitions tend to be kind of retrospective, and there needs to be more spaces for exhibition of current games, be them art games or not. So what can we help to do with, what can we do to help push the visibility of games as art? Well, in the same way that not all fine art needs to be in the halls of the most prestigious galleries on Earth, I believe that there really needs to be a push for galleries of indie games, whether this is with the inclusion of games directly into fine art gallery spaces, or for utilizing spaces that are for games that already exist. It could be argued that arcades are the original game art galleries, and Glasgow is so lucky to have seen an increase in indie arcade spaces over the years. But one thing about a lot of these spaces is that they don't actually often consider a lot of local indie. You could probably go to about 3 different arcades or arcade bars in Glasgow city centre and find the same Simpsons or Crazy Taxi arcade machines in every single one. And whilst we do love these games and love to see them, we have such an amazing alternative arcade scene in Scotland, and it just seems such a waste that we have so few permanent exhibitions and spaces for games that allow us to celebrate local developers and art. The question I'll kind of leave you with is, how do we utilise these spaces to become more advantageous for artists and developers? And how do we begin to physically celebrate independent games? So to summarise, games completely have the credentials to be accepted into fine art practice, and what we really need to work on is physical visibility and supporting each other in a way that allows our work to feel present, local and accessible. Scotland has a really beautiful games industry, and it's an absolute shame that we don't celebrate it more publicly. And I really hope that this talk has maybe been able to inspire some people to create some more ridiculous and experimental games, because we kind of need them, and I love to see them. So last thing I'm going to leave you with, because I didn't want to just throw it up on a slide, I've uploaded all of my references, talks, literature, anything that I've kind of utilized in this talk onto a web page. So if you guys have any interest in listening to any of the talks or reading any of the literature, I would highly recommend. But it'll also just be on my website if you want to view it there. So thank you for listening. Did anyone need that, or?
Can you go back?
Go back. Right, there we are. It's all right. It'll be on the kind of main web pages. You'll be able to find it through my site anyway. But yeah, thank you for listening. So I hope that wasn't too heavy. And any questions? Thank you.
Sorry, I found it interesting you mentioned Roger Ebert and his attitude to, and there's a great quote of it that he gets repeated, that he said that cinema is a machine for creating emotions, and I think that video games are very similar to that.
Exactly.
Have you were comparing art to pictorial art. You were starting off from pictorial art, but cinematic art seems to me to be more
kind of closely aligned. Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. I think the thing is with games is that there's just such a wide breadth of all of the different types of games that we see. Some games are super cinematic, and then some games are literally just primitives on a screen and just, very kind of out there and abstract. And that's one of the really amazing things about the games industry as well. It's just the way that people choose to use interactivity as the message. So, of course, I think there are definitely spaces for, maybe we should have spaces that kind of align games and cinema, but I think in the wider scheme of things, we can do so much more with games as well. It's one of those things where either or, it all works, Anyone else? Or yeah?
It was just a check. See all the games that you had mentioned throughout it, will they be on references as well?
They should be. I do think I had a little section at the bottom for kind of like exhibitions, like video games specifically, any of the specific, just bits and pieces that I referenced. I might also upload some of the files from the dissertation that might include more references. I've just kind of like skimmed through the ones that are relevant to this talk. But there are so many more amazing things that I kind of touch on in the main text. So I might just throw a couple more of those on as well. Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's so many. To be honest, just even if you just Google art game and just go through a bunch of the major ones, you'll have a really good time with that. Anyone else? Yeah?
How much do you think context in which the game is experienced plays a role in whether or not it's considered art? I've noticed you had a slide there of the game Quap.
Yes.
The DNA in Dundee. And that game was originally a browser game that was freely distributed.
Of course, yeah.
And everyone just thought it was really funny. But then by putting it into a custom-built cabinet and then having it in the context of an art gallery, it's suddenly, does that legitimize it as art, or is that more of a sort of simple view of the art world there?
Well, I think maybe one of the things specifically that benefits Quap as a game is it's one of those games that I think even if you were just playing it back in the 2000s, you probably were, even if it was just in a Flash browser, you were probably messing about, playing with friends, having a good time because it's hilarious. So it's probably one of those things that physically does actually lend itself to the experience. And there's also so much to be said on how video game, I think I was originally going to include some of the talk on it, but I decided to kind of remove it just because it was a bit to the side. But there is this whole, idea in the kind of, obviously, the fine art arguments for games that performance or playing itself is art. That is also, as a player, we are also artists. So I think, yeah, of course, it just kind of depends on how you package it. I mean, the thing is, like, even if you're just experiencing games that are like, okay, this is an art game, I'm packaging it and marketing it as an art game, putting it out there as an art game, you know, if you're just experiencing that at home, you know, that's art. You know, you can experience art from the comfort of your own home or in a gallery space. I think that's kind of one of the really amazing things about games is they don't have to necessarily be super tangible or super over the top. We can kind of experience them as the sole kind of application experience, I guess. Yeah. Awesome. Anything else or anyone else or? Yeah.
About, like, would you say that indie games are more prone then to be considered fine art than like AAA or like big company games then?
I think so. I think it's one of those things. I think when a lot of people think of the art in AAA, a lot of it is down to the visual, which is so important, and obviously it's a huge part of the cinematic experience. And obviously, like we were just saying, you know, some artful experiences are just more cinematic. You know, when you think of things like Uncharted, you're thinking of that as like an artful cinematic experience. The Last of Us, games like that. So yeah, like I think when it comes to indie games, I do think, like as we kind of mentioned there, obviously there's a lot of stages that art has to go through to finally become fine art, and a lot of that is just down to obviously the movements and movements within the different industries and mediums that kind of give us the spaces that allow us to create more and move outside of the box and keep moving outside of the box. And that just kind of tends to happen a bit more in indie spaces, especially with the sheer amount that people put out games. You know, there's like 1,000,001 games uploaded to itch every single week, so it just kind of gives people more freedom to just really get out there with their topics. And I think there's also maybe a slight issue with in AAA with them maybe not wanting to be particularly risky with some of their narratives as well. But I'd love to see more from the AAA industry as well. It's not just, all this weight doesn't need to go on the backs of indie developers. It's something I'd just like to see generally is just more experimental video games, existing.
Yeah, for me, AAA,
Mm-hmm.
like, if I want to see fine art in them,
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm looking them with a magnifying glass at home.
Yes.
Like this musical joke they just made here, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
there's like an irony in this music or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, it feels like the artist had this restriction of like the AAA like structure
Mm-hmm.
and had to do like this little like Easter egg
Mm-hmm.
at the thing.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much. That's the thing as well. AAA games are so big and they're just so full of things, so full of art, so full of love and references from the individual developers. It's kind of hard to ignore them as art in their own right as well, I would say. Awesome. Anything else? Any more questions? Are we good?
Thanks very much, Shelby.
That's all good. No worries.